Welcome to the WanderLearn Show. I'm your host, Francis Tapon. In this episode, I have back Bob Edwards, Dr. Edwards, who is the author of a book that examines the death and disappearance and how Sandy Irvine and George Mallory, who went up Everest 100 years ago today, and we have breaking news that just happened a few days ago that Sandy Irving's foot was discovered. And Bob, welcome back.
Thank you, Francis.
So I'm not gonna ask you where you were when JFK was shot, but where were you when Sandy Irving's foot was found, and how did you learn the news?
I was here in Torremolinos, Spain, and I think on one of my feeds, probably Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn somewhere, um, I saw a post to say Sandy Irvine's remains had been found with a link to the National Geographic article, and obviously that took my attention.
Yes, we're gonna show a link for those who are following. Everybody can see. Bob, you can see on the screen. This is the article you're talking about, right?
That's it, yes, indeed. And obviously, I went immediately to that article and read it in its entirety, and there was no doubt in my mind that this was very momentous news.
So this is a picture of Jimmy Chin for those who are seeing on the screen, and there's the famous foot, the foot that took 100 years to walk down the glacier, I guess. This is a remarkable good news. The fact that Sandy Irving had his name engraved on the foot. If we're going to see on this picture here, there it is, A.C. Irving, and his full name was.
His full name was Andrew Comyn Irvine, and that label on his sock is undoubtedly authentic and is establishment beyond any possible doubt that this boot, the sock, and the sad remains within the boot are what is left of Andrew Irvine.
Right, and in fact, the actual human foot was inside the boot.
Yes, it's certainly a sad discovery, and it of course raises the issues of how his body came to be broken in this way, which we can talk about in a little while if you like.
Sure, and speaking about breaking things, it broke the internet practically. Instagram, as you can see here, had nearly 100,000 views on this particular post, and this famous post near about 764,000 views, likes. Sorry, not views, just likes alone. So nearly a million views. This is on National Geographic's Instagram, and on Jimmy Chin's, he got 764,000 likes. So assuming a 10x of that, you're talking about 10 million views or more, because not everybody who sees an image will click on like. So you're talking about tens of millions of people potentially have stumbled onto this news and are aghast. And you have written an article on Goodreads, which discusses your initial impressions based on that. So what I want to do with you, Doctor, is to go over some of your initial conclusions, realizing, of course, there's more information that you're waiting for as well. So let's start from the top. What do you think might have happened to Sandy?
Well, let's work backwards from Jimmy Chin's discovery itself. As you will have read, National Geographic rightly have not wished to disclose the exact location of that discovery. That's understandable. They're on Chinese territory for one thing, and everything they do has to have the permission of the Chinese authorities. So the only thing that they have disclosed is that the discovery was made on the central Rongbuk Glacier, which is a main glacier that runs from the north face of Everest westward and then northwards to the village of Rongbuk. What we can determine from this is it's not extremely important the exact location of the find. The fact that it is on the surface of the glacier means that it has traveled. Irvine's remains have traveled with the slow movement of the glacier over the last 100 years to the point where Jimmy Chin found them, and their origin must be at or very near to the head of the glacier. I think can say with some assurance that in 1924, those remains were at or near the head of the glacier. And we know where that is. It's you can see it on Google Earth.
Right.
With the reservation that the glacier will obviously have melted over those 100 years. And okay, on the screen there, you can see where the head of the glacier is. It's slightly to the west, bearing in mind this photograph, this Google Earth image has north to the bottom of the image. So west is on the right. You can see the Rongbuk, the central Rongbuk Glacier. It's a kind of oval shape at the bottom of the north face. You can see also that it's to the west of the Norton Couloir, the great couloir that runs down.
This is the couloir right here, right?
The northeast ridge to the top of the glacier.
Is it this one or is this one the couloir right here?
No, you're on the Hornbein couloir there. If you move to the left a little bit, yes, that very large couloir there is the Norton Couloir. Right. And as you can see, it runs right down from almost the northeast ridge with a kind of ledge of snow in the middle, a very large ledge of snow, which is a permanent ledge, and continues down to the head of the glacier. I can see where your cursor is going now. So where your cursor is at this moment, or just a second ago, Irvine's remains must have been at that point in 1924.
You're saying right here where the cursor currently is, correct?
Yeah. Sorry, let me correct myself. Irvine's remains must have been there at some point after 1924. And here I think it's as good a moment as any to propose two possible scenarios. Number one, that Irvine did indeed fall all the way down the mountain to the glacier on June the 8th, 1924. So that on that day, his body was there at the top of the glacier, at the head of the glacier. The second scenario, which I think is also consistent with the new discovery, is that Irvine died somewhere high on the mountain on June the 8th, 1924, and his body remained there for possibly decades and was indeed seen by the Chinese mountaineer Wang Fuzhou on May 24th or May 25th, 1960, which is a famous sighting. Wang Fuzhou disclosed that sighting in Leningrad in 1965 to the Soviet Geographical Society. And if Wang Fuzhou saw anybody at that point at 8,600 meters, it could only have been Irvine. And this is in 1960. So the second scenario, which is consistent with the discovery, is that Irvine died up there on the northeast ridge, or was immobilized and then died, and that much later, and in fact after 1960, by possibly natural events, his body fell down the mountain to the head of the glacier. So either of those scenarios are consistent with Jimmy Chin's discovery, and I'm unable to say whether one or the other is a more probable. I have to say that I have always taken Wang Fuzhou's sighting very seriously, and I've never found a reason to challenge it. And if that's the case, then Irvine died up on the mountain, and his body much later fell to the glacier.
Do you know how common that kind of movement of the bodies are? I mean, I know some bodies are on Everest are stuck there for many, many decades and they don't move at all. And why do other ones, well, presumably, is it fairly common that bodies can just roll down the glacier on their own?
Well, Francis, I'm not a mountaineer, and I've never set foot on Everest, so I don't want to give you an answer that is outside my expertise. In modern times, the vast majority of the climbs of Everest have been on the south side, on the Nepal side. You could maybe look up the statistics and confirm if that's the case. And therefore, I suspect that most of the bodies that remain on Everest are on the south side and not the north. The north has historically been very tightly controlled by the Chinese authorities. And I'm really not aware of how common such an event would be. Say that there is a very plausible descent route, which is the Norton Couloir itself. If Irvine, alive or deceased, should have fallen in the Norton Couloir, it is essentially a continuous slow snow slide which leads to the top of the Rongbuk Glacier.
On this map that we're looking at right now, I see two pins. There's this pin of right here in kind of like in the middle of the glacier, and then there's one way out to the far right of the image. But then the couloir that we're talking about is way out here on the left. So how does the body go to the right, if you will, so much?
This is my interpretation of the photograph which appears in the National Geographic. It shows Irvine's boot, and behind the boot you see Jimmy Chin. Mm-hmm. You look behind Jimmy Chin, you can see in the left of the frame what appears to be some kind of ice or snow cliff. I'm inclined to think that that formation is the western wall of the Rongbuk Glacier. The photograph is clearly taken looking to the north. If the photograph were looking to the south, you would see Everest behind Jimmy Chin. But you don't see Everest behind Jimmy Chin. You see open blue sky, so you're looking to the north. So behind Jimmy Chin in the left of the frame, you have some kind of ice cliff, which must be to his west. And therefore, I'm inclined to think that this find is on the western edge of the glacier. Again, I'm not a glaciologist, and so I cannot speak knowledgeably about how glaciers move and to what extent there are differential movements within a glacier between the center of the glacier and the edge. But I'm inclined to think that the body, or the remains, must have moved along the edge of the glacier, not in the center. It's a little difficult for me to imagine a solid object moving from the center of the glacier to the edge, given that the glacier is gradually creeping downstream. So I feel that the remains must have pretty much hugged the western wall of the western rim of the glacier during the time from when it first arrived at the head of the glacier to the point where Jimmy Chin found it. And that's why I have that red line on the Google Earth image pretty much hugging the western rim of the glacier. Now, you just asked a moment ago, well, the Norton Couloir is somewhat to the east of the head, which, yes, it's legitimate. I don't know to what extent. I've tried to do contour mapping of that area using Christoph Hofstadter's excellent contour map creator, which I've used a lot in the past, to establish where the contour lines are there, because the falling body should move perpendicular to the contour lines. But at the moment, Christoph's website is not working, and so I'm unable to do that analysis. It seems to me possible that an object could fall from the couloir to the head of the glacier. But if not, then the fall line must have been to the west of the couloir, and therefore not in a slow slide, but rather over very irregular rock surfaces and promontories. And if that's the case, then the fall of Irvine's remains must have been a very violent fall over rocky surfaces, and that perhaps itself would account for the breaking of his body. So, to my mind, there are two possible fall lines. One is the Northern Couloir itself, which, as I say, could possibly lead to the head of the glacier, but you do rightly raise a doubt about that. And the second fall line is to the west of the Northern Couloir, which necessarily must be over irregular rock surfaces.
We are very, very lucky that back then, 100 years ago, people would write their names on their clothing, as when they discovered George Mallory on his collar of his whatever coat or jacket or thing that he was wearing, it had his name, Irvine, in it. I mean, nowadays, imagine in 100, 200 years from now, when people find some dead bodies, they're going to think everybody that they found was called North Face.
I guess so, yes.
They're like, oh, another guy named North Face died.
Well, as you say, it was standard practice in those days for the early mountaineers to have their labels sewn on their clothes.
Right, but it's fascinating that they do it even on their socks. For God's sakes, they're that meticulous about this. It's amazing.
Yes, that's true. Well, it was standard practice, and I think it was to be able to distinguish their personal items after the laundry.
Right.
So that when you got your socks back, it was your socks and not somebody else's.
Now, I agree with you that it's hard to doubt Wang Fuzhou's sighting. In other words, I don't really understand what would be the upside of him making up that story. Like, why would he even invent such a story or concoct it? Now, maybe he could hallucinate it, I guess, but aside from that, I don't see any malicious intent, right? Can you imagine any reason why?
Yes, I have no reason to doubt his story. He was speaking as a representative of the People's Republic of China. Undoubtedly, he had been briefed as to what he could and could not say. And he was speaking to a distinguished audience made up of the members of the Soviet Geographical Society. So when he said that he saw a body at 8,600 meters, which is 28,200 feet, it was surely an approved statement that he knew he was permitted to make. And when he was asked by a member of the audience how he knew that the body was European, he said very promptly, this person was wearing suspenders, or what the British call braces. And this gives us two reasons to believe that Wang Fuzhou saw Irvine. Firstly, of any possible European who could have been at that height, it could only be Mallory or Irvine. Clearly, Mallory is excluded because Mallory's body was found elsewhere, far, far away. That leaves Irvine as the only possibility. And furthermore, there exists a well-known photograph of Irvine taken at, I think it's Rongli in Tibet by his good friend Odell, and it shows Irvine wearing braces or suspenders. Mm-hmm. So I think we have very good reason to believe that Wang Fuzhou did indeed see the body of Andrew Irvine somewhere on the North Ridge between the second and the third step. And if you can accept that observation, then it necessarily follows that Irvine did not fall to the glacier in 1924, but in fact that his body, long deceased, fell to the glacier after 1960 by some process which one has to assume was a natural process, either avalanche, ice slide, rock slide, but some kind of natural process moved Irvine's long deceased body down to the head of the glacier. And from then onwards, the movement of the glacial ice took his remains to where Jimmy Chin found them.
Do we know for sure that it was Jimmy Chin himself who found it, or somebody else on his team?
According to the National Geographic article, the way I read it is that Jimmy Chin personally found the remains. That's the way the article seems to read. It doesn't affect our interpretation of the discovery. I'm giving credit to Jimmy Chin because he's there in the article and he's shown in the photograph with the boot. I'm assuming he's the discoverer.
Right.
The same logic would apply whoever found it. And as I said earlier, I don't think the precise location matters very much. The glacial ice brought the remains to where they were found. They had to start at the top of the glacier, at the head of the glacier.
Now, a lot of people...
And they had to reach there by a mechanism which, as I said, the scenario that I find most consistent with all of the facts, so that we don't cherry-pick the facts, is that Irvine's body was seen in 1960 and fell or slid, possibly not in one single movement, in the subsequent years to the head of the glacier. And then the movement of the ice, which I think would probably be in the range 10 to 30 meters per year, would take those remains between 1 kilometer and, say, 3 kilometers down the glacier from the head of the glacier.
Okay, so now I guess we answer one of the questions, which is a lot of people have been speculating on the internet, telling you precisely the GPS coordinates of where I know Sandy Irving's body is going to be found right here. Just go there and look. It's going to be there. And people said with such confidence that that's exactly where the body was. And I wonder how many people are now saying, well, maybe not.
As I said, it doesn't much matter the precise location where the remains were found. The important point is that they got there by the movement of the glacier, and they had to start at the head of the glacier. I think a much more significant disclosure, if National Geographic were willing to make it, would be, were the remains found at one or other edge of the glacier or in the middle of the glacier? Because that would give us a more precise location of where at the head of the glacier the remains first started their journey. The head of the glacier is a relatively well-defined place, but it's still something like 100 meters wide. So if, for example, Jimmy Chin or National Geographic were willing to disclose, we found the remains on the western edge of the glacier, that tells us the fall was more likely to be to the west of the couloir and therefore over rock. If they say the remains were closer to the eastern edge of the glacier, then it's most likely that they hugged the eastern edge during their journey, and they started more close to the northern couloir, which would make the northern couloir the more likely fall line. So that would be one disclosure that would, if National Geographic were willing to make it, that would help our understanding of the fall line.
A lot of people speculated that the Chinese removed the body decades ago, and that's why nobody could ever find it. Now, one corollary to that idea, for those who are still clinging on to that theory, they could say, well, there was no natural process that dropped Sandy Irving's body down the mountain. They pushed it down, and they just pushed it off the mountain just to not have to look at it anymore.
I've seen conjectures to that effect. And there is, of course, no evidence to support such a conjecture. It's possible in the sense that everything is possible.
Mm-hmm.
Francis, as you know, I like to be guided by Occam's razor. That's to say that I like, if I have a choice between a simple assumption and a complex assumption, I prefer the simple one. To make a conjecture about the actions of the Chinese is a complex assumption. It involves human agency where there's no necessity for human agency. So I don't really wish to explore that conjecture at all. It's an unnecessary conjecture.
How about we explore a different conjecture, Dr. Edwards? How about assuming, let's say, that he died in place. It sounds to me, if I'm reading you correctly, that he died where Wang Fuzhou found him, high up on the mountain. And then would you guess, what would be your best speculation? This is pure speculation on your part because you need a lot more information to make a reasonable judgment, but that he died first and then later Mallory kept going on his own. Any clue of what might have happened on that day?
Well, as you say, this is necessarily speculation. If Irvine died at the place where Wang Fuzhou later saw him, that had to be on the descent, because, again, if we accept another celebrated sighting, namely that of Odell, Odell saw Mallory and Irvine at a place which, to my mind, could only be the third step, and they were going upwards. So if Wang Fuzhou saw Irvine, or the body of Irvine, below the third step, then that must have been on the descent. Mallory's body, as we know, was found far to the east of that and about 2,000 feet below. So the most plausible scenario for me would be that Irvine either became immobilized, not necessarily died, but reached the point where he could no longer move, and that's the point where Wang Fuzhou saw him, and that Mallory at that point would be unable to carry him or help him. And again, obviously this is complete conjecture, that what would Mallory do in such a circumstance? He would go for help. And since there was no one who could possibly help at Camp 6, which was empty, he would aim for Camp 5. And the point where Mallory's body was found is on a line towards Camp 5.
Right.
This is obviously nothing more than conjecture.
Right.
But let's say if I had to construct a sequence, it would be that Irvine was immobilized first. Mallory was alive when Irvine was immobilized. Mallory continued his descent. At some point, he had a disaster and died. Clearly, he had a fall which broke his leg. We probably have to assume that fall was not far from where he died, where his body was found, since it's practically impossible to imagine that he could descend the best part of a kilometer with a broken leg. So he must have broken his leg near where he fell, or near where his body was found. So the scenario is that Irvine is immobilized, Mallory does what anyone would do, which is to go and look for help. Mallory falls and dies. If Irvine was immobilized at that point, he would have died later. But whether after Mallory or before, I don't see that we have any way to know.
It's possible so they might have had a malfunction with their oxygen supply, for example, and that would, make them extremely weak and disoriented, and Irving could have just collapsed right then and there, perhaps without oxygen. There's a million other scenarios. And of course, we don't know if Irvin injured himself. He might have twisted his leg or broken his ankle, and Mallory was forced to move on without him, for example. Either there's a variety of scenarios where Irving would have been incapacitated.
We can't possibly figure out what would have been the proximate cause for Irvine to be unable to continue or to be immobilized.
Okay.
On the descent.
No, two more questions, Doctor. One is, I want to just confirm again why, if we're looking at this image here of the map, why these pins, I'm still confused as to why they're so far to the right of the image and not where this red line that you drew here.
It's just simply two alternative assumptions about the surface ice velocity of the glacier. I have no data on the ice velocity of the Central Wrongbook itself, but I have some data on the ice velocity of the East Wrongbook, which is a tributary of the Central Wrongbook. And those data date from the 1950s, so they are closer in time. They're measurements made by the Chinese. They're closer in time to the events that we're discussing than to the modern day.
You're looking at the map right now as you can see my cursor right now on your first point. Now I'm looking at this, I just imagine I'm drawing it straight up. This is where he's falling from, this way, go all the way down, and he'd fall here, and then the glacier would recede or move downward like a...
No, that cursor represents one of my alternatives as to where his remains were found last month.
I understand.
Not where his body, not where the remains fell. The remains fell at the left-hand end of that red line.
Oh, over here.
Yes.
And if I draw a line straight up, you're just saying somewhere along this line it fell. But I guess I would think the river, the ice river, which is what a glacier basically is, these what's it called, slow moving rivers of ice. Yeah. So I would think it just goes straight down this way, if you will, versus left to right. I would think it'd go top to down, or at least,
Well, I think, again, you need to talk to a glaciologist about this. But I'm inclined to think that the center of the glacier moves quite quickly because that's where the bulk of the ice is, and it will move in a direction more or less straight downhill.
Right.
Whereas the rim, the edges of the glacier are likely to be impeded by rock and by irregularities in the base of the glacier, and that's why I think that the remains probably would have hugged. Again, I'm starting from the viewpoint that the remains were found near the rim of the glacier. I think it's more likely that if they were found near the rim, they started out near the rim and they remained near the rim with fairly slow-moving ice, rather than moving down the middle of the glacier. Because if they had moved down the middle of the glacier, they would have been found in the middle of the glacier, and yet the photograph in National Geographic seems to show they are not in the middle of the glacier. They are close to an ice cliff, seemingly about a few yards away.
Last question, Robert, the one that we like to speculate the most on, which is the famous camera. And of course, the rest of his body. Now, I understand at the end of the article, you talked about the fact that now they need to work with the Chinese authorities. Chinese authorities have to approve that National Geographic or somebody else has the right to search more for the body. But obviously, nobody knows whether the camera will be found. And of course, if it were to be found, whether any of the film would be capable of being developed and all sorts of other stuff. But at least there's a little glimmer of hope that this infamous camera might turn up one day.
Well, I do expect that there will be a further expedition. I think that's practically certain, whether by the Chinese authorities or by National Geographic themselves. And I imagine that the rest of Irvine's body is not far away, possibly no more than a few meters, together with any artifacts that he may have had on him. I wrote in my book that there is no evidence whatsoever that either Mallory or Irvine were carrying a camera. And I know that it's the dearest wish of many aficionados of this story that one of them was carrying a camera and that it could reveal something. As I said, I have seen no evidence that either of them had a camera on them. If Irvine had a camera on him, when you consider the state of his remains, it seems to me extremely improbable that a camera could have survived that same process which broke up his body. So personally, I would not hold out any hope whatsoever for that to happen. But I would say one thing, and I think this is an enormous opportunity for the Chinese authorities, that on Irvine's boot there must surely be particles of rock, which will tell a story about where those boots had trod. And if you subjected those particles, if you knew what you were doing and did it very carefully, using an electron microscope or molecular spectroscopy, you would be able to determine, at least within some margin of uncertainty, in what strata of rock those boots had trodden. And it's, I think, well documented that the summit pyramid of Everest has substantially different chemical composition from the lower rocks, the gray band immediately below the summit and the yellow band below that. So there is an opportunity, and it's an opportunity that was missed in the case of Mallory, to look for particles on the boot and to test them for their comparability with the summit strata. And that has to be done very carefully, and we have to hope that the boot has not already been contaminated by handling to the point where such analysis would be lost.
Dr. Edwards, thank you so much again for your fabulous analysis of this historic event. It just coincides on the 100th year anniversary and on the year of the publication of your book, The Last Step But One. Everybody who wants to see the original interview I had with Dr. Edwards, go in the upper right-hand corner on YouTube, click on that video, or go down in the description to click on the link there, as well as getting a link to go buy his book, which is a fabulous book that goes into much greater detail about the whole famous climb 100 years ago when Mallory and Irvine died. And it's still very much relevant today. All the things that you said there are still highly accurate, and nothing that we have learned since this boot is found has changed any of your analysis. And we haven't learned anything dramatically new. Wouldn't you agree?
If you'll permit me, Francis, I will say this. There isn't anything in my book that I would change at this moment.
Exactly. And I would agree with that. It makes a ton of sense to me. So still very valid. Nothing has been invalidated from your book at all, from the discovery. And all we can do now is learn some more information. And maybe you, going back to our rock analogy, the rock particles on the boot, if we find the body of Irvine and maybe in one of his pockets could be some rocks from the summit, that would also be a game changer as well.
That indeed would be a great step forward in our understanding.
Dr. Edwards, again, thank you again and for this emergency meeting, and we will be in touch Stay tuned. Subscribe to the podcast because we'll be interviewing Dr. Edwards about his 2 other books. One about D.B. Cooper, right? And the other one is about the most bizarre manuscript ever. Do you want to give us a little hint about the most bizarre ancient manuscript ever?
The Voynich manuscript, that's right.
Right. We'll do that in the future episodes, so subscribe. Thank you very much and take care. Don't forget to wander and learn.